Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton joining you, or you're joining me rather, for another hour of podcasting greatness here on YouTube, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, and wherever other good podcasts are sold. And as you can see, I am joined this week by my good friend and ever awesome guest, Jon Atack. So, Jon, welcome to my show.
Right, and welcome to my show as well. Yes. Isn't this wonderful? We do a show in tandem.
I know, I love it.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And this is somewhere around number 25.
Oh, so, yeah. I mean, the playlist is so long
losing
now.
Count, you know.
Exactly.
Count.
Well, it's gotten to the point now where we pretty much are just having a conversation and we hit record. I mean, it's kind of what we've been doing for a while now with this. And in fact, for today, we'll intro this, guys, by saying that we were having a pre-show conversation about critical thinking. And of course, this is near and dear to my heart, as it is to, you know, the heart of all thinking people. and critical thinking is important stuff. And I have said in the past that I believe, in a way, critical thinking is an antidote to cults and cultic behavior. And Jon and I have had some disagreement on this, and we were talking about that. And then Jon suggested, hey, let's go live. And I went, you know what? Let's do it. So here we are continuing that conversation.
So I you know, and I apologize that I've ruffled your feathers, and I understand how. But I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
What happened was I was having a conversation with the wonderful Sarah Edmondson, and out of nowhere, and for no reason whatsoever, I pointed out that you, in a conversation you had with Sean Atwood, which we won't get into, had said that, and he was asking you for something, you know, at the end of the show to just round things up, and you said cults are the antidote. Sorry, you can get the wrong way around it. Oh no! Critical thinking is the antidote to cults.
Yeah.
And I sort of went, well, I don't actually believe that. Yeah. And that, you know, has led us into a little thorny patch. And because, you know, we're good friends and all of that, I can ask to be forgiven. And we can actually talk about, if you could pretty much say what you've just said to me.
Oh, absolutely.
Why critical thinking is, as a term, is so important to you. Why you know, this life-saving force for you.
Yes.
So tell us all about that.
Excellent. Let me pontificate. I am big on critical thinking, and I use it as an umbrella term for a lot of stuff. So let me be clear about this, because critical thinking for me is not just a matter of, you know, knowing some logical fallacies or understanding how debate or rhetoric work. That's the very most surface level use of what I call critical thinking. You know, it's a discipline, and I have used this discipline purposefully, not purposefully, I mean, intentionally and not. At the first significant time I engaged in it was while I was still a Scientologist, and I was questioning the conspiracy theories that we were surrounded by, and that I was literally using to recruit new Scientologists, new Sea Org members. I would go on this whole roll, do this whole briefing. I had this whole picture of this international conspiracy, and I could map it out. I drew pictures. I used whiteboards. I was really into it.
Oh, I wish I'd seen that. Maybe we should do a show about that.
I know. It was impressive. So impressively
David
stupid.
Icke, Alex Jones, James Corbett.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
all in there.
That's right. Oh, I had video clips of Icke and Jones. We would have them watch a whole DVD from Alex Jones. Anyway, debunked all of that.
We'd probably have millions of followers if we did this.
I know. That's what's so funny. So I, debunked that for myself with critical thinking, just sort of questioning, just asking some questions. And if I was really going to reduce critical thinking down to a core statement, it is be willing to ask questions. Be willing and able to ask questions. You know, if there's anything that's going to get you there, it's going to be that. And by asking questions, I was able to start looking at information that I had previously not been able or willing to look at, that debunked the conspiracy theories. And then suddenly, oh, wait a second, if this is true, then this can't be true, and that means this can't be true. And before you know it, like a pack of dominoes, you know, the whole thing falls apart. or a house of cards or whatever. And so, so that was kind of big for me. That was kind of a big deal. But I was still in a cult environment, and oddly enough, was questioning some of what was going on around me, because this was post RPF, but still not questioning enough to get out. That took a few more years.
Let's just throw in for anybody who's not acquainted with the terms, the RPF is the Rehabilitation Project Force, which is the kind of gulag, the labor camp where anybody who has disagreed in Scientology, who works within the C organization, as Chris did very bravely, that's where you get sent when you've got to be reprogrammed. It's kind of like the Chinese re-education camps, but
that's
Scientology's version. Yeah,
that's right, exactly. So I did that RPF program, and that that weirded me out for a bit, but then finally got myself out of the Sea Org after a few years, and was kind of done with the Sea Org life. And it was again critical thinking that came to the rescue, because within 3 months of getting out of the Sea Org, actually about 5 months of 3 months of diving down the internet rabbit hole, curiosity was driving me. Critical thinking was driving that. If I wasn't critically thinking, I would never have gone down that rabbit hole. I never would have looked those things up. And so somehow that instinct or drive to be curious and satiate my curiosity, kind of pulls me along on these threads. And then after Scientology, after 3 months, I wasn't a Scientologist anymore. And that was a real big deal. And emotionally, I was incredibly pissed off. But rationally, I was in a better place than I'd ever been in my life. I mean, I was finally free of L. Ron Hubbard's bullshit, right? And that was big. That was a really big deal. Then comes the big question about 2 months, 3 months later: how do I make sure I never, ever have that happen to me again? And of course, the answer to that question is you can't. But
exactly,
you can fight. You can do things. You can defend and arm yourself with critical thinking. And it was actually Googling, how do I spot bullshit? How do I find it? How do I know when I'm being presented with bullshit? This was literally the question I was asking. And what came up? Carl Sagan, right? Bullshit detection kit, right? And which he, of course,
the bamboozle, the demon haunted world.
That's right. That's right. So all of that comes clear, and I read Demon Haunted World. I adopt critical thinking as a formal subject, like, oh, this is a thing. People study this. There's lesson plans online. There's curricula. There's books. There's all this stuff. I'm like, oh my God. And I try, and I, like anybody, you try to dive into logic books and textbooks and stuff, and you get lost in 2 minutes. It's crazy. I can't think with symbolic logic and all this other nonsense. So I'm not suggesting that people need to become logisticians or get PhDs in philosophy to be good critical thinkers. And in fact, I think that in a way, some of that, you lose the plot of the practicality of it a little bit when you get off into the weeds of the academia of it. It's great to know the history of Socrates and Plato and all that, but it's not intensely practical. What you need rules, you need guidelines, you need some ideas, and what you really need at the heart of this whole thing, in terms of my description of critical thinking, is you need the discipline of critical thinking. And now what I do is I try to draw a martial arts analogy to it. It's discipline. It's a practice. You have to practice. You have to train your mind in the same way you have to train your body with martial arts. You don't know on day one how to punch through a board. It takes discipline. It takes practice, practice, practice. It's the same thing with critical thinking. You don't know on day one how to spot a logical fallacy. You don't know how to spot when somebody's telling you something that you kind of think it doesn't make sense, but you don't quite know why. Trying to figure out and dissect those kind of things and figuring that kind of stuff out. That's the intensely practical stuff. And then the last thing I want to add on that is, for me, and maybe this isn't as big of a thing for other people who talk about critical thinking, but for me, it's a life skill. And so I am always, kind of weighing it against its practicality and usefulness in life. And that means that I have to include the reality that human beings who think also engage in emotion. And emotions are powerful, and they're powerful influencers, and they have a lot to do with why and how we think the way we do. So for me, emotional intelligence and understanding the emotional component of our thought process is part of the critical thinking thing. It's not a Mr. Spock, all is logic kind of approach to life, because that's not how we live life. So that's in a big nutshell my take on critical thinking and why I think it's so important.
And I think that's the important thing that has to be appended to the comment.
Yes.
That critical think, because we have to have a definition of critical thinking.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm hesitant about it, because when I was working at Open Minds, I wrote I think 180 articles for the website.
Wow.
And the only subject that stymied me completely was critical thinking. I spent months picking up books, reading articles, and trying to see what the definition of critical thinking was.
Yeah.
And by the end of that, I just gave up. So that's my hesitation. It's not what you are doing or your approach to life. Yeah. I think we agree pretty thoroughly about that.
Yes.
That you've got to work out what is a good source of authority. Who are the experts?
Yep.
When the experts clash, look at both sides and see what's going on. I mean, for me, I was already involved in critical thinking because of Plato and the, what Socrates had said, because this was a way of approaching problems. And I loved it. I have a brother who's 7 years older than I am, so he deluged me with literature, which was way beyond my pay grade. At the age of 14 and 15, he tried to get me to read Kafka and Sartre and things like that. Had to destroy a child's mind.
Right.
But among this was a book translated by Evie Rieu, who my brother's very fond of, which were the Crito, the Phaedo, and the last dialogue of Socrates. And, although I couldn't manage Voltaire and Sartre at that age, I could read this, I could understand this. It was very straightforward.
Yep.
And that what Socrates was saying was, you get this thing that he's told that the Sibyl, the prophet, has said that he is the wisest man in the world. And he's like, what? You're kidding you. And he goes out and he talks to the wisest people, the people who are thought to be wise, and he realizes they're not very clever. And out of this comes this, what he's called the Socratic method, where rather than starting from the premise, I know and I will prove to you that this is true, you start from the premise, I don't know and I think you're wrong. Which is much easier. As an agnostic, it's really easy for me to deal with any faith, whether it be atheism or theism, because I don't have any beliefs to defend. Right. So pointing out how silly other people's beliefs, I'm in a very safe place.
Right.
So it's really about that and the way I responded, I hope not too crassly, to the thought was I looked at two of the founders of critical thinking and what they came to believe. And this is the point where thought and belief is important. One of them is Robert Thewlas, and I cannot recommend Straight and Crooked Thinking too much. It is a brilliant work, which was updated by his grandson eventually, the last version. And it really does touch everything that we've talked about so far. Thewlas was a professor at Glasgow at the time. He later became a professor at Cambridge, so it's very... And his book, he'd written a bit before, but suddenly in 1930, Straight and Crooked Thinking becomes an international bestseller. And a whole movement comes out of it. And I think it is pretty much the origin of the critical thinking movement, which is a very sensible idea. But what I pointed out was that 40 years later, he was writing a book which is called From Anecdote to Evidence in Psychical Research, because he was on the board of the Psychical Research Society. He believed in extrasensory perception. He believed in telekinesis, and I don't.
Right.
So this brilliant thinker, this man who gave us tools for critical thinking, and the other person I cited was William James. Really, along with Gustave Le Bon, they're the founders of modern psychology.
Yep, that's right. Certainly American psychology, William James.
Yeah, and James has an influence all over the world.
Oh, yeah.
The varieties of religious experience. I read about the first 50 pages and put it down, and 10 years later came back to, just after I left Scientology, I picked it up. 10 years later, I came back and kicked myself for not reading it all the way through. Because when he talks about, for example, conversion and the fervor that people feel, and he says, if you're a fervent believer, you'll become a fervent disbeliever.
Yeah.
And that's certainly, and he was the first person to alert me to this concept of the feelings of knowing, what he calls noesis, that we think we know. The example I always give, I gave it to Toronto when we first met, and it's my favorite example. I was 17. This guy stopped me on the street and gave me two hours of waffle about Jesus and how great Jesus was. And it just so happened that I just reread the Gospels. But, no longer as a believer, not as a disbeliever, just agnostic, charming. Some really useful things are said in there about being nice to people. I like that.
Yep.
Getting the money lenders out of the temple, that's probably a good idea too. I don't know. Separating the wheat from the chaff. Yeah, if you're going to make bread, you've got to do that. But I'm gluten intolerant, so I have to keep away from wheat and chaff.
Right.
But so I happen to be able to quote back at him, and say, well, where does Jesus claim that he's the Son of God? And he's like, well, I say it's John the Baptist, isn't he? He hears a voice saying, this is my only beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. But later on, when he's brought news of John the Baptist's death, he's lost his head, he says, not that I believe the words of men, saying that he's not sure that what he's been told is true. And that's a really interesting statement.
Yep.
Not that I believe the words of men. Who wrote these Gospels? It was men, wasn't it? And this guy, you've seen me do it. I just waffle on and until people run away. And he backed off from me.
Yep.
And he said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. Those are feelings of knowing.
Yep. There we go.
And we all do it.
Yep.
We all do it.
Well, and you can see that we have to in order to get along in life.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to move if you had to analyze and evaluate everything. What is in this glass of cordial? Where did it come from? Is it really good for me? No, it's got sugar in it. So, oh no, why am I drinking it? Oh, damn, I mustn't drink things.
Exactly.
We have to. There's this integration within us. So many people over the years have said to me, I don't believe anything. And it's like, do you believe that?
Right. That's a great retort. Yeah, exactly. Because we all believe things, we have to by necessity.
I got to this thing after, I share your view. After I left Scientology, I was high for a year. It was great. I didn't have to conform my thinking to Ron Hubbard's perverse view of the universe anymore. I didn't have to get an ideal scene and go through all of this stuff. It was wonderful.
Exactly.
It's the most liberate. And yet I meet so many people who, when they leave the group, are just completely lost. They don't know what to think anymore, what to believe anymore. I was going, I don't have to believe any, and it allowed me to start again, to say, I can empty all of this stuff out, and then I'll look at it bit by bit and see if I think it's true.
Yep.
And I didn't. It's 38 years later, and there's not a single aspect of Dianetics or Scientology that I hold to be true, because anything that did seem to be true, I found the origin of.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a paper called Possible Origins for Dianetics and Scientology, back in 93, somewhere around there. And I found all of these places. Now, Hubbard himself said that you should always look to the original source of material. So I just did what he advised. That's the one piece of advice I will hold to. The genus, as he said, misusing the word, of information. But I didn't just look to Aleister Crowley, who's the origin of most of Scientology.
Yep.
From the birth engram through past lives and the visualization of creative processing and the guiding of the imagination, which is the heart of Scientology. I didn't just look to Aleister Crowley because he too is a plagiarizer. I looked to where he'd got ideas from, and on and on and on. And so any ideas that I've accepted and there are a few, the core ones, reacting trauma, reliving trauma to get over it. I'm not really sure how useful that is.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is occasionally useful to some people, but work done in the 90s suggests that debriefing, as it came to be called then, they took people after accidents, and some of them were debriefed straight away, by the paramedics, and others were not. And they found out that the people who'd been debriefed actually suffered the trauma for longer.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because you're reifying it, making it more solid, as Hubbard would say.
That's right. That's right.
So, the behavioral approach of, forget that. Find a new way of thinking about it and a new way of behaving, instead of going, oh, yeah, when I was 3 years old, I wanted this custard and my nanny wouldn't give it to me, and I'm really upset about it still. It's coloured my whole, it's like, just get over it, grow up. And go and buy a custard, if you really want a custard that badly.
Yeah.
So,
well, if I might address something you said there about just a little earlier, just on something I'd like to contribute on what you've run into, and completely understandable. You look at somebody like a Newton, or William James, or the other person you mentioned,
Robert Thewles.
Yeah, Thewles. Yeah, exactly. And of course, with a modern look back, what I think when I see these people and these examples you cite is I see somebody whose emotional needs were not being met in some fashion, or who had some emotional attachment to a belief set that had to be true, or they really wanted it to be true. Now, I have not engaged with the Thewles guy, so I don't know if his experiments were legit, were unbiased, were an approach of, I would like this to be true, let's do some experiments and see, or no, this is absolutely fucking true and I'm going to show all of you people, right? And if it was that kind of an approach, well, that's not necessarily the objective approach we want in science. And I get that. I get how that could be frustrating, but I'll also point out something. And this is just from my own research into emotions, but the fact of the matter is that emotions have not been something that have been studied at a very deep level for a very long time. And our concepts of emotional intelligence even, and the role that emotions play, what emotions even are. I mean, I challenge you to go get a solid definition that will hold up between neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry, and sociology for the word emotion. You won't
challenge you to find anything that will
anything that'll stick
any
up,
of those
right?
subjects where they'll agree about a damn
exactly
thing.
Right. So good luck with that. Yet emotion is clearly pivotal to the experience of every one of those fields. I mean, emotion has something to do with all of those. And so understanding what emotions are, what role they play, how they are both good and bad, what's the coin here, what's the good side and the bad side, is something that is a very recent study. And maybe that study is producing answers that make sense, and maybe it's not. Really only time will tell with some of that. But looking at the best we have right now on that line, I've taken it in and tried to use it and adopt it into my critical thinking repertoire. And I'm only pointing out that I'm able to do that where James and Thewles and Newton and these other guys weren't, because they didn't have the literature and research we have now. And I have to comment on that because science and progress and critical thinking is all evolutionary. It all builds on earlier stuff. So I get the frustration at watching people who are otherwise very rational engage in very irrational behavior, but I don't think that needs to nullify the importance or use of critical thinking in that sense.
Yeah, but there is a little worm built into what you just said.
Yeah, tell me.
And that is critical thinking 1900, critical thinking 1950, critical thinking 1975, critical thinking 2000.
Yeah.
Where is the point where critical thinking became perfect?
Oh, I don't know that it is. I don't know that it is
exactly.
Yet. Yeah.
So if we look exactly to Newton or Galileo, they were cheats. They were not only not scientific in their approach, 50% of Galileo's experiments are forgeries. If you look to the 3 copies of the Principia Mathematica by Newton, he actually made his results table better in each edition without doing any more experiments. He spent more time doing alchemy than physics.
Interesting.
And trying to prove that the Bible contained a code which would show the dimensions of the Temple of Solomon, which would be the dimensions of the universe. The guy was a lunatic. But Galileo, Kepler, you can put him in as well, Copernicus. I think what's important is to say that, or one of the important things is that the belief system you're within is not the significant thing, but you have to be aware of that.
Yes.
So if we're saying Chris Shelton's view of critical thinking is the antidote to cults, we might be able to get somewhere. But if we make the broad statement critical thinking, well, Robert Thulis's critical thinking, Newton's critical thinking, the problem is that, so I absolutely don't disagree with what you said. It is important to think about things.
Yes.
It is important to think critically.
Yes.
It is important, using the old skills of rhetoric, which is a topic that's been with us since Socrates, at least.
Yeah.
And used to be taught in schools. All universities taught rhetoric from, the foundation of Bologna, I think, was the first of the European universities in the 12th century, Oxford and the Sorbonne in Paris. They are founded with this subject called rhetoric.
Yeah.
Rhetoric drops out of the curriculum in the 1950s. It lasts all of that time.
Wow.
And it drops out because Latin is no longer taught. And so the lectures of Cicero on rhetoric, which I haven't read, in case anybody's thinking I'm actually clever, they drop out of the curriculum.
Huh.
And rhetoric says you first of all learn how to analyze a problem. That is, how to break it down into its basic parts.
Yes.
You then evaluate what you have, and you then should be able to articulate what you found.
Yes.
And all students were taught this. Now nobody's taught it.
Yes. And I will be the first to say that is a crime against humanity.
Yeah, and instead we have all of these curricula which call themselves critical thinking, and they may have the 128 logical fallacies that you can go and do an exam on. I think Thulis is a really good starting point for anybody who's watching here, because you do get a very straightforward description of the fundamentals of this topic of how to think about things, and
that's right.
Like the distributed middle. That's my favorite. That you find things like how specious reasoning can be done. All cats have 4 legs. All dogs have 4 legs. Therefore, all dogs are cats.
There you go. That's exactly. That's right.
The syllogism of Aristotle, which L. Ron Hubbard mistakenly, in the false data stripping bulletin of all places, attributes to Socrates. It's false data, Hubbard. In the Phoenix lectures, he knew it was Aristotle, but by the time he gets to telling us about false data, I can't trust him.
Well, it's probably the case that he didn't even write the damn bulletin, but, I stray from the theme here.
Yeah, I mean, all of those later things are extracted by Ray Mitoff or whoever was at the helm.
Exactly.
Jesse Prince and Nancy Meny at Toronto. Jesse he said he found Nancy reading the famous OT8 bulletin where he described, he's saying he's Lucifer and the Antichrist, and she was crossing out the bits that weren't written by Hubbard. And Jesse said, you're absolutely right. I saw the construction. How do you know? And she said, I had so many communications from Hubbard. I know his inflection completely. And so, there are later on, Hubbard was too lazy to actually edit anything he ever wrote. He never reread anything, as far as I can tell. So he could contradict himself at will. So I interviewed a guy called Ken Rose. I was in LA in '93, and he'd been the head of Ron's Technical Compilations. They had to change the name from RTC because they got another one.
That's right. RTRC. That's right.
Yeah, and he said everything, every fart, every burp, every whistle this man emitted from the early 1970s onwards was recorded. And we will never catch up with everything he said, and good luck to them. So it means Miscavige can now, grab, well, he said this thing here, and, and we get all this stuff. But yes, false data series, the truth rundown, the key to life, all of those later things, he's just over the hills and far away. He's completely lost it. And every now and then, in the midst of the dementia, he comes out with something like, well, Socrates invented the syllogism. And you go, no, he didn't. It was Aristotle.
Exactly.
Well, I think that the essential that, again, we'd agree on is that we need to be skeptical about the world. Mm-hmm. And just as you were skeptical about, conspiracy theories within Scientology, I found that same thing. As a young Scientologist, at age 20 or so, I read von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods.
Oh, right. I remember those. Oh, those were so electrifying. I remember being a young man reading those things and just being like, oh, what? Yeah.
It's the way, the truth, and the life. And I believed it. And I went from there to the Illuminati. I read the 3 novels of the Illuminati and went, oh, yeah, see, that's what's going on. So I have to say, I was young and foolish. I'm old and foolish now. Right. So the age has changed at least. So when I talk with people who are into, the Illuminati did this, and it's like, well, actually, no, the Illuminati actually disbanded after 10 years, the Bavarian Illuminati. And, while it is lovely to believe that the devil is controlling the world, or whatever name you want to give to this entity that you believe controls the world, this is a paradigm that doesn't work for me. I think there are probably about 150 distinct corporations in conspiracy and contest with one another in the world.
Yep.
Not just one or two.
And very much what you just said, it's CNC. It's conspiracy and competition.
Yeah.
It's not just they're all in some tight-knit conspiracy and they meet every year at G6 or something. This is, it's so much more complicated than people think.
To get ready to talk to Sean Atwood, who is an interesting, if eccentric character.
Yes.
Who, as one of the commentators pointed out, has a head like an egg and ought to grow a beard so he can see that he's not an egg and whatever. But in preparation, I saw that he'd interviewed David Icke and I couldn't resist it. So I watched the one with you, I watched the one with David Icke. And I sat there going, he's making sense. What's happened to David Icke? Because he said, well, basically, the unidentified flying objects, of course, the Russians and the Americans seized the plans for the jet vehicles that the Germans had built. In fact, I can give a bit more information on that because I read a bit more than Ike's done, that they got this one, I think it's 45 meters across, the Russians, and the Russians actually got it. The Americans got blueprints because they'd managed to destroy the craft. These things had VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing jets. The Messerschmitt 262 had jet engines. They were the first people to build them, and they built these craft. So when the Americans and the Russians were trying these things out, did they try them out? No, we won't bother. They've got these things that fly beyond the speed of sound. We wouldn't want to do that, would we? When they tried them out, of course, they had to make stories up about them. And Ike gets to this point where he's actually realized what these things are. Then he starts talking about aliens.
Right.
And you're going, don't you get it that it was the Russian and American intelligence agencies that made up the stories about Area 50, whatever it is.
Exactly.
And Roswell and all of that as a cover. And they still are. I think it was only in the last couple of years, there's been a US agency report saying, and it could be aliens,
Yes.
No, it isn't. It's you're lying swine. So,
well, I will certainly give over that's a more logically consistent explanation to me than that, aliens are secretly visiting us and controlling our DNA and stuff. I'll certainly say that, or that, lizard people from other dimensions or something, or.
But Ike had such a gall that he eventually said, oh, yeah, I'd taken a lot of ayahuasca and when I saw the lizards. And that's not really true. And you're going, so what is really true? Because his whole method of inquiry, and anybody that is that fascinated can watch my conversation about Andy Nolch.
Yes.
Debunking. Yes. Andy Nolch debunk. You don't have to watch the other things there about Scientology. But taking apart his conspiracy ideas that Andy came up with this thing, and he actually says, John should believe weaker evidence. There's such a thing as circumstantial evidence. And I'm going, when I've got strong evidence, why should I believe this? And he tells this wild story about, if my boss is seen holding hands with a bloke and he wears lipstick, he's probably gay, so I'm going to make a video about it. And why have you got to make a video about your boss being gay? What is wrong with you? Who cares?
Right.
And you do know that Arab men hold hands and that actors wear lipstick. That it's, your weak evidence is not necessarily, was he in a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta when he was wearing lipstick? There's context here. But this thought that you can use, there's inference, which is where you've got information from which you infer, and there's implication, which is where you've got a hint. And so many of these people, they're implying. Yes. It feels as if it fits in with their way of looking at the world. So for me, I agree with you, but I would say that what we have to have is humility.
Well, that is
what our critical thinking is. Am I willing to challenge what I believe?
Yes.
And am I willing to can I come to the point, and it may seem masochistic, but I don't think it is. Can I come to the point where I enjoy cognitive dissonance, where I like being challenged, as long as people are polite about it, and can then go, I hadn't thought about that. Maybe L. Ron Hubbard was just a narcissistic fat man who was bullied as a child because he had red hair and terrible spots, who went around with a huge lump on his head and whose teeth fell out because they all went rotten. Maybe that is the truth of Ron Hubbard, as so many people I've interviewed have told me. And as the photographs show when it comes to the lump on his head, a massive sebaceous cyst, just that he wouldn't go to a doctor about. And this guy's a superhuman. And then you get to the independent Scientology saying, yes, we know he was a liar and a scoundrel, but he white-taped the route to getting out of your head.
Yeah, what? What are you talking? I mean, if he can't demonstrate it himself, how do we have a route out? I mean,
feelings of knowing.
Exactly. Because it's not the case with Ron that, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. But look, he got the product anyway. He didn't get the product. He didn't produce calculus. He didn't produce a book on critical thinking. He didn't produce even that much. Everything he produces is crap. Yes. And that's the bottom line with L. Ron Hubbard, is literally everything the man produced is crap.
Except for the system of enslaving people, which is possibly the most refined such system ever made.
Boom.
That here we are, two, let's say, reasonably intelligent people who spent years of our lives dedicated to this man, and you're going, he wasn't all that. Whenever somebody tells me he was a genius, it's like, he was a genius at conning people.
Yes, exactly.
But when it comes to an understanding of physics or photography or music, oh no, he seems to have been a reasonably good navigator. But did he navigate us into a good place?
Exactly.
I had a real shock. I was talking with Karen Telekaria a week or so back.
Yeah. And
we were talking about overboarding. This like when they're in Corfu Harbour, he's throwing people 4 stories down. This is not the high board at the swimming pool, the 14-foot board. This is like at least 25 feet with your ankles tied and a blindfold on, and you're being thrown into the cold water of the Mediterranean because you were 2 minutes late for a course, or you smiled at Hubbard at an inappropriate moment, and I know all about that. I only found out about it after I left Scientology. Nobody mentioned it to me. Oh, by the way, you're now in a group where they chuck people off. Nobody ever mentioned that to me. But I left, and then I saw the photographs in Auditor number 41, double-page spread, where this guy is being thrown overboard, photo credit L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah, so they promoted that they were doing this.
Yeah, at that time. And they're still doing a version of it, throwing buckets of cold water over people, chucking them in the lake at St. Hill.
Yep.
Just this appalling, traumatizing people so you can de-traumatize them. Okay, which is what the whole point of Dianetics was. Well, now we're giving them the engrams so that we'll be able to recover them later. But she told me something which in my involvement with Scientology now is 47 years, which is appalling. I was a 19-year-old lad when I first got involved. I had never heard this before.
Yeah, what did she say?
She said, of course, they were in harbour. So all of the ships were putting their sewage into the water. So they weren't just being thrown into cold water, they were being thrown into human sewage. So as part of the road to freedom by this wonderful philanthropist, the Buddha Maitreya, who had come to save us all. It is such abject nonsense.
Just total nonsense. Well, listen, let me say one thing real fast before I forget on the tag end of what you were just talking about with critical thinking a few minutes ago, and then I want to segue perfectly over what we've already been kind of segueing over to, which is predators, right? Human predators. But let me say this, because you hit the nail on the head with humility. And what the only contribution I have to make to that, to add to that, is I was going to say, there's that discipline factor of critical thinking. I'm not kidding about that. It's discipline. It's practice. You got to work to be a good critical thinker. There is not one human being I have met who is a natural critical thinker. And again, I'll draw the analogy in the same way that there's never anybody I've ever met who was born breaking boards and bricks with their hands. It just doesn't work that way. You got to learn how to do it. The point I wanted to make... Some
people have more of a talent for it. Rembrandt and Michelangelo, by the time they were 15, were doing amazing things. But they had to work to get to it, and they had to keep working to be able to do it.
That's right. Exactly. And
it's so easy to con yourself with this stuff. It's so easy to think that now you know the truth.
Yes.
No, you don't.
Exactly. And that's the point, is there's a very core piece of information that if you know and keep at the forefront of your mind a lot, or try to remember it or post-it note it or something, it's really important piece of information. And that is that and this is a modern thing. This is something that was in philosophy for years, but now we actually kind of know. Your brain doesn't exist to give you rational, logical, objectively true answers. That's not why it was evolved the way that it has. It's never been its purpose to give you the objective truth about reality. Your brain only needs a story that makes sense to you. And that's it. That's all it requires for you to survive in the world.
And, there was no purpose for evolution. Evolution just happened. Random mutation. The idea there's any design, intelligent or unintelligent, going on, it isn't there. What's more, the mind, and I'm accepting the philosophical premise that the brain is an aspect of mind. The mind is a predictive mechanism.
Yes.
It's going, what's going to happen next and how am I going to deal with it?
Yes.
And when we get into the sense that we now know everything, we've cracked all of the problems. We talked before, you read On Being Certain, a wonderful book by Robert A. Burton. Well, he wrote another book, and I wrote to him and said, look, I think you're absolutely brilliant. And he actually wrote back and thanked me, which I thought was nice. He's a neurologist.
Yes.
He was the head of neurology at Mount Sinai. A Skeptic's Guide to the Mind, in which he undoes many of the big claims made for neurology. And we come back to, I think it was Wittgenstein, who basically said, well, you have to be very suspicious about any mechanical basis for the mind.
Yep.
And we move from one set of certainties to another, and it is good to, humility, you can kind of test it by saying, I'm being really humble now. I mean, Trump in one of there's this little book, Think Like a Champion, I think it's called. And he says in it, one of the things that people don't realize about me is how humble I am.
Oh my God, that is just like my old joke. I constantly will joke with people. Oh yeah, my humility is my best quality.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's matched only by my self-effacing attitude
and the enormous phallus that I.
Yeah. Right. So exactly, it's really important that we remember that our version of the world is our version of the world, and it is constantly being updated and revised by our brain. And if we can keep the disciplinary view in mind all the time, or as much as we possibly can, that we only see what we see. We don't get the whole picture. We're never going to get the whole picture. We're not capable as individual human beings of getting that. So you got to be humble, because you got to always be willing to question your own conclusions and the conclusions of others. And if that's not critical thinking, I don't know what is. And that's,
and you'll also have far less problem of people calling you an arrogant bastard.
Yeah.
Because I am told, and I've never read the man, I'm told that Immanuel Kant in the 18th century pointed out that there is the world out here, and then there is the world in which we live, each one of us. L. Ron Hubbard had a kind of...
Yes. Oh, he hated Kant. He was always down on Kant. He was.
Yeah, and that's your other...
He made a joke. I remember in the communications chapter, he was like, well, if Kant couldn't, and if Aristotle, you know, whatever. I mean, he was trying to make little jokes, but he was, you know, he was always making jokes about Kant, you know, because
absolutely. Because somebody had told him that these were big, difficult books.
Yep.
I very much doubt that he opened them from my experience of Hubbard. He if he could get the Reader's Digest or the Boy's Own version of something, certainly All About Radiation doesn't even get to the Boy's Own level of understanding.
Right.
But this point that Kant makes, Korzybski, who again Hubbard steals ideas from,
yep,
and who's important to the development of rational emotive therapy and cognitive therapy. This idea, the word is not the thing itself.
Yep.
You know, you've got to realize that you're symbolizing in your head, but the map is not the territory. And we can only ever live in the map. We can only ever live in our own perception and interpretation of the world.
Big time.
And by reminding ourselves of that, you know, and I am one of those people who has to, because I do get way too big for my boots frequently.
It never happens to me, so I have no idea what you're talking about.
I think we all know that,
Yeah.
Chris.
No.
So I wanted to actually interject something from...
Yeah.
I have a copy of Straight and Crooked Thinking here. This is
the book I need to read.
It's was actually his grandson came back to it and updated it. Very sensible gentleman. So there are so many things that could be said, but it says the learned author of a textbook on logic may be quite unable to come to reasonable conclusions on a question in which his own interests are deeply involved.
Yes.
For example, job security for university lecturers. Education does not in itself save us from this disability. It ought to help us towards freedom from prejudice, but it does not necessarily do so. Learned academics are often as bound by their prejudices as anyone else. Learned persons may defend their most unreasonable prejudices by arguments in a correct, logical form, while the uneducated defend theirs by illogical arguments. The only advantage this gives the learned is the fact that they can marshal formally correct arguments in defense of their errors. This may make these more watertight against opposing arguments and opposing experience. Mastery of the art of thought may simply make unreasonable opinions more unassailable. So that's what we have to, you know, we have to be careful about. And we have to keep, as you say, we have to keep coming back and thinking again.
That's right.
And saying,
that's right.
You know, so when you look at von Daniken, for example, in Chariots of the Gods, there's a picture of the Nazca lines, these beautiful images of birds in, is it Peru, which are laid across the ground. He says, you know, an alien spaceships could have landed on these lines. What he doesn't point out is that the photograph is of a piece 1 meter long. So they would have been very tiny alien spaceships.
Really, really small.
Okay, Earthlings.
Yeah, and it's, you know, and by the way, let me throw one more log onto the fire on the critical thinking discussion, just because I just thought of it and I should have said it earlier, which is the element of time, because that's an important piece of this. Okay, you know, something I want to point out is, you know, after getting out of Scientology and exploring the big wide world and looking at the realm of possibilities, you know, I very much glommed onto social values and trying to make the world a better place through recognition of human rights and stuff like that. And I'm going to beat that drum till the end of my life, I'm sure.
Yeah, me too.
But when you get on that train, like with any other situation, you can get into extremism. You can get into taking it too far. One, this taught me that it's not the belief or the issue, it's how far you take it that is generally at issue. Unless you're talking about, like, you know, neo-Nazi beliefs or something. I mean, outright, obviously destructive stuff. But when it comes to human rights and stuff, nothing wrong with that. But you can get in an extremist headspace about it. And that extremism is never going to help. It's always going to make things worse. Whether it's going to be, you know, that you're blowing off allies, that you're not getting allies, that you're not able to recruit people because you're just too extreme. You just come across as a radical crazy person, right? Nobody wants to be part of that. So I recognized elements of that in myself, you know, in some of these values after a few years of being out of Scientology. And I went, whoa, hang on, this isn't what I want to be or do, or, you know, how I want to come across to people. And I had to pull the reins back on that. But I will again suggest that for me, in the way that I think about things, and it was only because I was willing to question myself, have some humility, you know, drop the need to be right about things and be right about what I have said and done in the past, because I have said some really stupid shit, you know.
We all
haven't we all, right? And I have to own that I have done that, and that's part of the process, right? And so that humility element is very, very important, but also that you have to give yourself a little bit of a break, that it's going to take time to realize things sometimes. It doesn't hit you all at once. It's not a light switch. That's not how our beliefs generally work. So
not a cognition.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, the epiphany, right? More like a bognition. So, anyways, you got to give yourself a little bit of breathing space for that, and not kill yourself over those kind of bad decision making that you've made in the past. Because if you did come to a point where you realized it was wrong, good, you did that. Acknowledge it. You know what I mean? I have to, and I'm only saying this so vociferously because I'm kind of talking to myself as well. Because this is how I am. I love glomming onto things and running with it, but you can run too far, too fast, or go too far with it, and it sometimes takes some time to recognize that you've done that, and then pull back on the reins a little bit. You know, so I wanted to include that as in part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I seek to live passionately. I seek to invest myself fully in life and experience it, and that means that sometimes, you know, you will go a bit too far. One of the things that Thulis says is that the point where critical thinking, straight thinking as he calls it, goes out of the window is the point where you start getting emotional. And he says as soon as we start investing emotionally, it is time to stop, take a breath, and think about what's going on.
Yep.
People, you know, this left and right thing, the left and right are terms in America that mean something kind of different to the rest of the world.
Yep.
And
so I've come to learn.
Yeah. So, you know, you have words like libtard.
Yes.
Great. Or repturd. That's what I invented. You can go either way with this. Those are people who are reptilians. I'm not talking about Republicans, obviously.
Obviously.
But this left and right, to me, the left and the right are both authoritarian extremes.
Yep.
I believe in democracy, and
yep.
That brings us right to the heart of our next conversation, because the reason that Churchill said this thing, you know, democracy is the worst system of government ever devised, except for all the others.
Which I still agree with.
He's a weird character. He really was a dreadful, awful, brilliant, wonderful man.
Yes.
You know, the European Convention of Human Rights, he wrote it. The idea of having a European Union, it was his idea. And yet he, you know, he just loved war. He just loved fighting his whole life. You know, really brilliant man. Also, what a sense of humor when a woman sat down next to him and said, if you were my husband, I would put poison in your coffee. And he looked at her and straight back said, Madam, if I were your husband, I would drink it. Which is
exactly
the only possible response to that. But so to me, authoritarianism is the core subject. That the reason that the world is in such dire trouble is because of authoritarianism. It's because of bullies. It's because of human beings who believe themselves to be the ambassadors of God or the devil or some great higher powers, and that they are right and that they should be adulated and obeyed.
Yep.
And that's the history of monarchies, dictatorships, tyrannies, which is largely what history consists of. We've talked about this before, and I brought up the Indus Valley civilization, which for 700 years managed to not do this.
Yes.
So human beings can, live in peace with one another. It has been done. There's a society, they think now, civilization that existed in the Ukraine, but it's proving a little difficult for archaeologists in the Ukraine at the moment because circumstances are rather dangerous there.
Yeah.
Which is sad. But we have a tendency to follow people who are predatory and destructive.
Right.
And, in Scientology, we got all this stuff about the suppressive person, the antisocial personality. After I published what is now called Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, I had a letter from Richard DeMille. Richard DeMille was the son of Cecil B. DeMille, the famous film director. He was actually his blood nephew, but was adopted by him. He wrote 3 books under the name L. Ron Hubbard. The most famous of them is Science of Survival. And he wrote them from Hubbard's notes. They're not works original to him, but he brought together all of these little recordings. Hubbard, even then, was recording things on these little green discs. I have seen one of them.
Little wax discs, right?
They're not wax. They're
kind of, something that can be impressed upon, though, with a recording device.
Yeah, they were recorded with a needle, so they're an analog recording.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think what the plastic is called, but I knew a collector called Ron Newman years ago, and he'd got one of the original discs that Science of Survival came from.
Really?
And, yeah.
Oh, I would have thought those were up in the archives, all locked away. That's fascinating that they're out in the world. A
lot of stuff, went out and about, and a lot has been destroyed along the way. But Jerry Armstrong managed to. I think he said that he'd collected 600,000 individual artifacts and documents, some incredible number in the 2 years that he was doing it. And I talked with Robert Vaughan Young and Stacey Young, who of course took over from Jerry, and there's also like his baby boots. That's where it starts with, that they got Ron Hubbard's baby boots. It's an article of worship for people to kiss them, and whatever. But DeMille wrote me, then became a professor of psychology. He wrote a book called How to Put Your Mother on the Ceiling, which smacked of the creative processing of Scientology, or Aleister Crowley, who originated it, to me. But he was involved in exposing Carlos Castaneda as a complete and absolute destructive, horrific fraud, a man who made up his stuff and seems to have left a trail of dead bodies behind him, which not enough has been said about. Literally, bodies buried in the garden. This was a really horrific, terrible man, much beloved of the hippies. And you can't sit on a mesa in blinking Arizona in the hot sun for 4 hours without shriveling to a crisp, even if you can turn into a crow and fly off. It's complete nonsense. He sat in LA in his apartment and wrote all that stuff. It's just, so he was involved in that. But so he's a guy who knew Hubbard. He looked after the baby when Hubbard stole his daughter. And he was, DeMille was right in the thick of it for a little while with Hubbard. And then off he goes, he becomes professor of psychology, and out of the blue, I get this letter from him. He said, I've read your book, and it's the best book ever written about Scientology, and I've read them all. And that was like, yes. Mine's the best of the 3 books. I think there were 13 that I found before mine. And everyone has it, Doctor's Report on Dianetics. Dianetics in Limbo by Helen O'Brien is a masterpiece of understanding of Hubbard. But he said, but the thing I enjoyed the most is that you point out that the only true suppressive person was Ron Hubbard. And, okay, I started from there, and then I left Scientology, and of course I was trying to find out where Hubbard got ideas from. So I read The Mask of Sanity by Hervey Cleckley. Now, this is the book that all modern work on psychopathy begins with, written in the 1940s. Robert Hare, the great Hare psychopathy checklist revised, which is used throughout the English-speaking world to diagnose somebody whether they're a psychopath or not. He started from Cleckley. And so I read that. And in the 80s, I talked with a couple of psychiatrists about Hubbard. And one of them told me he was crazy. That would be the correct word to use for Hubbard. But that was Frank Gabody, who was himself at the time was a Scientologist. So maybe his psychiatric diagnosis. And I got some idea of, what kind of person he was. And he did indeed seem to me to be a suppressive person. When I looked at Cleckley's definition, it seemed to be a lot more useful than Hubbard's. Hubbard evidently devised about half of his points from Cleckley, but then kind of wandered off.
Yeah, I wondered how much Hubbard was looking in a mirror writing that policy, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And very interesting that he conflates three things: a suppressive person, the anti-Scientologist, and the antisocial personality.
Yes.
They're the same thing. If you're against me, you're an antisocial personality.
Well, he did that very much on purpose, right? Very much on purpose. I mean, he had to, especially in the 60s when he sets up the surveillance culture, he has to conflate these things because it must be that Scientology is at the senior position of every equation any of these people are making.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most frightening realizations to me was that Hubbard, I'm pretty sure, there were days when he believed and days when he didn't.
Yeah.
There are many instances. So while he was working on Science of Survival at the end of 1950 and living with his girlfriend, Barbara Cloden, Barbara Snyder, he said to her, it's nonsense. It doesn't work. I don't know anything. And of course, in Science of Survival, he cancels the original Dianetic technique because it's hypnotic. He says, you will see the eyelids fluttering. This is a sign of trance. And he cancelled it. And then in the 1970s, it's all brought back again.
Standard Dianetics, that's right.
I wrote a paper called Never Believe a Hypnotist, which is a quotation from Science of Survival in 1951. Never believe a hypnotist. This is a man who admitted he was a hypnotist. See? Never believe a hypnotist. Okay, what are you trying to tell me, Ron? In that paper, you've got the chapter and verse of him saying the technique used in book 1, Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health, is dangerous. Not only does it not work, but it does harm. And then it's brought back again. So, that's a little bit of a contradiction.
A little bit.
He some days, again with Sarge Fouth at the end of his life, he's saying, I've misled people. It doesn't work. And I think that's true. But other days, he thought he'd cured himself.
Right.
Because his tummy didn't hurt anymore for a day.
Right.
Or he could draw breath properly for a day because he hadn't got his annual winter bronchitis. Every year the clearing course comes out of it in 65. OT3 comes out of it in 66. I'm dying. And when the bronchitis goes away, it's like, I have broken through the wall of fire. And then the next year it comes back again. So there's that tension going on in him. And he identifies this thing, which he first of all calls a merchant of chaos. I think that's the first expression for it.
That's right. That goes all that. Oh, and there was he talked briefly in a pab in 1952 or 3 or something about a vampire personality.
Oh,
yeah.
That'd be like Gordon Melton, wouldn't it? Vampires. Oh. Little in joke there.
Yeah, total in joke.
And so I leave Scientology and I'm reading Cleckley, and that quite interested me. And as these thoughts, this is in the 80s, as these thoughts percolate through, I'm trying to go, yeah, there are people who are like that. There are people, and for a while I called them dismissive people because they're people who just put you down. And then I don't know, five years ago or something, I decided, read the literature. So I read Without Conscience by Robert Hare. I read Snakes in Suits, which he co-authored, in which he revises some of his earlier ideas. He's originally saying, well, psychopath is a word that says this is something you're born with, and sociopath is a word that means this is something society does to you. And then, which is fairly true, but he later on says, well, if you score from 4 to 30 on my checklist, you're a sociopath. And if you score from 30 to 40, you're a psychopath. So it becomes a spectrum. And I think I question whether his checklist it's not a rigorous instrument. It requires a great deal of evaluation as to where you're going. And I started going, well, it's not, I don't really want to diagnose anybody. I want to be able to say, what are the characteristics of people who are dangerous to us? And then I came upon this notion of human predators,
Yep.
And Donald Trump, who seems to be coming up frequently in my conversation, the author of The Art of the Deal, who, for anyone who's watching doesn't know, wasn't Donald Trump, was a man called Tony Schwartz. He said that during their conversations for that book, Trump said that his father, Fred, had taught him there are two kinds of people. There are predators and there are prey.
Yep.
If you read, there's a book called Pimpology, which I don't really recommend, written by a man who was a pimp. And he says there are pimps and hoes. Those are the two kinds of people. And you get this, Hubbard's into the two terminal universe, two types of everything. Life's a bit more complicated than that. There are people who are not predators and not prey.
Well, it's interesting because Hubbard himself also, wrote a bulletin called Two Types of People. Remember? The black hats and the white hats. Yeah. He followed that model exactly.
And it's the model of the neocons that Strauss taught at Chicago to Rumsfeld and Cheney. That are guys in the white hats and the guys in the black hats. Well, no, that there is very small quantity of people, perhaps 2%, who are classifiably criminal psychopaths. They are utterly destructive people. 3% of men, 1% of women, it is said. Women make up by having more borderlines, whatever that is. But you then get all of these other kinds of personality, the Machiavellian personality, the very devious people, the narcissist.
Yes.
Which is specifically the malignant narcissist.
Yes.
Which comes from Eric Fromm's book Heart of Man in 1965. And Fromm makes, I think, a vital point about narcissism, and I track this a little bit further. And he says, Freud's wrong. Calling these people narcissists is wrong because they don't love themselves. They don't love anybody. They don't know how to love.
Yep.
That's what's wrong with them, that they need adulation to feel that they even exist, to give them the sense of self. And they collapse if that's taken away from them.
Yep.
Vulnerable narcissism and all of that. And we talked about this before we started recording, that we both come to this point, well, what about benign narcissists?
Exactly.
What Fromm says in his Escape from Freedom in 1941, which is his book about the Nazis and how Nazism came about, and he lived through that, of course, and he was a communist Jew in Germany, so he had to get out of there in 1933 rather quickly. And he modified his views as he went on. But he says probably about 60% of people fail to develop a self. They are a pseudo-self. And they well, what do you think I should order? Well, how do you think I should look? Well, am I doing this right? We've got a new BMW because the neighbors have a BMW. Am I living up to the expectations? What Freud would call the superego, what I tend to call the inner policeman, this idea of not being fully whole, and where we should mature into adulthood as whole selves, capable of making decisions, capable of doing something. Maybe 60% of people don't. And they become authoritarian followers. They become people who, because they cannot trust their own opinions, and their own identity, look to somebody else who, maybe paints everything gold, or not mentioning any names, excuse me, and seek identity as part of a group, as part of a following. Now, at its extreme, the benign narcissist, so many of our artists, so many of our performers are actually people who are hollow. David Bowie said that Major Tom was him, that it is about his sense of isolation. And he said he had no connection to his parents. He was an only child. And he desperately wanted adulation. He was very honest about this, very open about it. And so Ziggy and Aladdin Sane, these characters he creates, are this attempt. And I think that he matures. Yep. I think when you see him in later interviews, he, we got to that thing before about the cunt in a clown suit.
Yes. That's right.
Which is a self-observation.
Yep.
You told the story of he's doing Ashes to Ashes in the movie with a little clown suit on, and some guy's walking his dog in front of the camera, and then the director says, "Don't you know who this is?" And he says, "Yes, some cunt in a clown suit."
Exactly.
And Bowie tells the story, which tells you that he's got over himself. Yeah. That he's understood.
That's right.
And the narcissism has gone. For me, the shift that needs to happen in society is for people to develop individuality, not to agree with one another and do what the boss tells them, and not to wreck anything or destroy anything, but to say, this is what I like. This is what I want. These are my preferences. So you have artists who seek to please other people and take adulation. Their work will probably never be any good, or rarely ever be any good. And then you have artists who seek to please themselves, to reach their own tastes and preferences, and you can tell them. I was in Pasadena many years ago at what was then the Norton Simon Gallery, which is one of my favorite galleries in the world. I've been there 4 or 5 times. And I was...
Yeah, I grew up about 5 minutes from there. We went there a couple times. Yeah.
Oh, great. Just
great museum.
Norton Simon's own collection in there. It's one of the, I think, 4 collections there that he could just about still afford to buy Degas pastels and little Cézanne paintings before he then starts the Southeast Asian collection, because he can't afford it anymore. The prices have gone so crazy. He really had the eye, though. If you go to the Tate Gallery in London, most of the stuff in there is rubbish. Because it represents, we bought the cheapest thing we could get by that artist. Whereas Norton Simon, every piece is beautiful. It's in the Cambodian collection. That was the first time I'd seen Cambodia. But anyway, there's a painting in there by John Singer Sargent, American painter. And I'm short-sighted. I hadn't got my glasses on. I was 40 yards away from it, and I immediately went, "It's a Sargent. I know it's a Sargent." He's not first-rank famous painter. And it's because of the movement, the shape, the color. He's a man who discovered himself. He's a man, you can't mistake things for a Rembrandt or a Da Vinci. They have it. There are 2 Da Vinci paintings, the Madonna of the Rocks in the Louvre, the Madonna of the Rocks in the National Gallery in London. The one in the National Gallery was painted by pupils. It's obvious. When you see them, you can see that one is a masterwork. These are people who have, expressed their own selves. They've become individual, and as individuals, they might be quite difficult. Rembrandt was incredibly boastful. He knew he was brilliant. Michelangelo, actually, they had to cut his leather clothes off him because he had not washed or changed his clothes for months by the time he died. So I'm not necessarily saying they became saints and angels, right. But they became themselves. And that should be the objective for all of us. Not how well can I imitate David Bowie, but how can I become this person, which is me? What is the best of me? Yeah. And in doing that, we can shift that kind of 60% of people into a majority, possibly, where democracy would be possible, where people would vote I saw something coming from Israel's endless elections. They seem to happen every 2 weeks. And a woman was coming out of the polling booth, and the journalist said, "And who did you vote for?" He said, "I voted for Netanyahu or whatever." "And why did you vote for Netanyahu?" "Because my rabbi told me to." It's not really democracy, is it?
Not exactly the idea of it, no. But if you're dealing with people, but it's a tough call when you're dealing with people who are apparently incapable of individual thinking for some reason. I mean, according to the theory here.
I think that's the thing that there are two aspects of play, aren't there? Nature and nurture.
Yeah.
And I think because our nurture systems, our educational systems are authoritarian, they're about obedience, doing as you're told, that if kids were taught, I always come back to our friend R.H. Aleff's Intelligent Disobedience.
Yep.
A brilliant book. Everybody should read it. Very straightforward and obvious, that he had somebody in one of his talks who said, "Oh, I have an example of what you're talking about." And he was under the desk here and brought out a guide dog. Said, "I'm training this guide dog. The guide dog has a blind person. They have to be able to say no. They have to be able to say, you're going to walk into something. Stop."
Yep.
Why don't we teach our children this assertiveness? Why don't we have a society where you can do what we've just done, in fact, where I said something that was irritating to you, and you're able to come to me and we're able to talk about it. I'm able to apologize and we're able to clarify what we mean. Now, that is how community should work, instead of people throwing rocks at each other and, or bombing each other or blowing themselves up or what have you. And I think a lot of that is to do with an educational system. And there are hundreds of really fantastic schools, and teachers are possibly the most important people in our society, and they are so undervalued, and they're made part of a machine. My two youngest boys, who both thankfully out of school now, but the amount of times that in different schools, one after another, I'd be talking about them getting an education, and the teachers would be saying, no, they have to jump through hoops. And that was the expression that was used, jumping through hoops. And eventually I sat in a room with 4 teachers and a educational psychologist and said, when do they get an education? And there was silence. And it was like, when Matthew Lipman, the great educationist, he quit his job teaching philosophy at Columbia because he said, by the time I get them, it's too late. Yeah. They're 18. It's too late. So I think that we can, I have this wonderful thought that in a few years, we could actually change society all over the world. It's one of the great virtue of YouTube, which now, counts 90% of education on the internet comes through this channel. I'm not tremendously pleased about the people who run it and their ideas about how the world should be, monetizing things. And it seems, I don't know if you get this, but most of the ads that are on my channel seem to be trying to recruit people into some kind of cult thinking. And I'm glad they spent their money on putting it on my channel, because they're going to get less recruits.
Yeah.
But it's abundance, or do what Ken Wilber says, or be mindful, or no. But I do think that we can sabotage the system, I think, by putting ideas, by helping kids recognize human predators.
Yes.
By helping them see the techniques that are used, and by teaching critical thinking, by teaching ways of being able to tell whether, I use the Institute for Propaganda Analysis system, which has just 7 points in it. You can find it on Wikipedia. It was written in 1938. I went to the great expert Anthony Pratt-Karnes a few years ago and said, I'm writing a piece about this. He was on the board at Open Minds then. I'm writing a piece about this. I'm starting with the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And I thought he'll come back and say, that's so out of date. And he came back and he said, it's brilliant. And they were closed down in World War II because people would see that Uncle Joe Stalin, maybe wasn't quite the way to pitch this thing. Looking at those World War II posters, it's frightening. Our friend Mao and the nasty little Japanese people, All of that.
Wow.
If we teach kids these simple things about, seeing that something's not right, I think we could change the world. And I think it could be done in one generation so one of the things that bothers me is that most of the people I talk to, you and I are sort of on the edge of what's called the counter-cult world. I think we're both more concerned really with helping people to think and be themselves rather than, I don't think either of us is fighting to destroy any group. We have kind of exposed Scientology a little bit now and then,
Yeah.
But the idea is to help the people who've been trapped in it, not to hurt them. But in the counter-cult field, there's so much of this infighting, so much of this pessimism. These people are, we're fighting a losing battle. I don't feel that at all. I feel tremendously optimistic about the human future. I think we now do have the tools, the toolbox, and the means to use them. The only problem is distributing those things.
Yeah.
It's getting out to millions of people. And the obstacle to that is that we live in an authoritarian, predatory world where, somebody who drives a Lamborghini into a swimming pool can get 15 million views.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we definitely
people are that stupid.
Spectatorish jackass world. That is true. That's definitely something that exists. I don't know that it's so different from every other world that's ever existed. I think we see it the way we see it, and we think it's unique and different from everything from earlier generations. And I just say that because I'm constantly surprised at how history echoes. And
I agree that, and the tyranny we see and the gesturism, it is, human behavior is not that far different. Somebody slipping on a banana skin is funny to many people. Pratfalls and all of that kind of thing. I was talking with my friend Christian Sherko about Buster Keaton earlier. Fantastic stuff. But I do think that we've come to an understanding that maybe what is important is understanding that the only way forward is democracy.
Yeah.
If we let people like Bolsonaro and Duterte, Modi, Abe, this host of, or Putin, these awful people, if we let them run the world, or if we allow the American and European plutocratic system, those with power, those with wealth, how things are reversed. People tell me that there's a communist party in China. No, there isn't. There's a fascist party in China. This has got nothing to do with anything that's communal or which is not just, I'm not a particular fan of Karl Marx, but I do think he was right that women shouldn't be oppressed. I do think he's right that everyone should have the vote. And I do think that we should be giving into a community to make things better. The idea that, for example, we can not have a health system. In the US, you don't have a health system that is for everyone. Here, we've had one since the late 1940s, and it's a really good thing because it means you don't develop diseases, incubate them, and spread them.
Right.
Unfortunately, our country is being run by an idiot who did all of the wrong things. So we have incredible death toll from COVID because the sensible things that were done in Taiwan and South Korea were not done here.
Right. Or here.
But if you don't have a health system, then poor people are going to get diseases and they're going to give them to the rich people. So you have to have a certain basic level of good sense here. And this idea that
you would think that these kind of things would be more obvious. You really would.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, I swear to God, you really would think that would be that way. But people are what they are. I agree with you about the educational component. I don't know about one generation because I think it would take two, because I think it's going to take one generation just to get that implemented.
Well, let's talk about what a generation is. Let's be very exact.
Oh, okay.
Technically, a generation is 30 years.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I look at the worldwide education system, and I look at my ideas of how that could be improved, and I'm talking about things like not getting rid of standardized testing, but the sorting hat at the beginning of this whole thing is not there, and it really needs to be there. We try to crunch every kid into one mold. That's wrong, because we have you could easily justify at least two molds: a vocational aspect or a vocational sort of direction of training versus a more intellectual or academic role or move forward. And I'm not talking about sorting on IQ. I'm talking about sorting on child's interest, proclivities, activities, things they're good at. Stuff like that. You got to make decisions there, and I think more decision making could be made that might customize or tailor, our education for the kid and how the kid learns and what the kid's good at and is interested in and is proficient at. And and I think there are ways and means of finding out or developing those skills and again sorting more properly so that people are living the life they actually want to lead. More, through education, it actually empowers them to live that life, carry out those skills, do those things they want to do. Because there are people who really enjoy the physical labor and the arts and the this and the that. And there are other people who are really into the intellectual side of life, and they give me the numbers. I just want the numbers. I just want to play with numbers all day. I get joy from numbers. And you go, good, there you go. There's the numbers. You go have fun. Whereas the guy who's more interested in fixing the cars because he really likes engineering and mechanical things, they get a different sort because they're different kinds of learners doing different kinds of tasks. And so you have to have a base. You have to have a base education of reading, writing, arithmetic, and all that. But you have to customize too. And that alone would be huge. If we could then add on top of that a component of critical thinking and humility and teaching about the way of life with predators. Oh my God, that would be awesome. Awesome. And
I think I agree with you. And I think so much of we have to go back to the beginning. We were saying with critical thinking, the idea is to question everything.
Yeah.
And our educational system, I got into this, and it fascinated me. Where did universal education come from? It was first in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 1760s, and it collapsed. They tried to educate everybody. The next time is in Prussia.
Okay.
And there are two Humboldt brothers, and one of them is where Darwin comes from, that he is a huge fan of Alexander von Humboldt, after whom there are more plants, animals, rivers, mountains named than any other individual, because he's the man that opened up the natural world at the end of the 18th century. But his brother, Wilhelm, is commissioned by the King of Prussia to set up an education system because the Prussians had been beaten by Napoleon at the Battle of Jena, and they were pissed off. So they set up a system which has run from, I think, 1806 till now. And the idea was you need to train soldiers. People have to be obedient. That's what school is for. In this country, universal education, I think, is the 1870s. And the idea is women need to work in factories, so the children have to be somewhere. And then the middle level is we need civil servants to tell the Indians and those people in the subcontinent what to do. And then you get the Boy Scouts, which is we need soldiers. That is absolutely where Baden-Powell, I think that's how he pronounced his name, got the idea from. And the chapter on masturbation, which causes all mental illness, according to Baden-Powell, was taken out of Scouting for Boys, and in the new later traditions, it's back in there. And I didn't know that. Did you know that masturbation is the cause of all mental illnesses?
I not only did not know that, but in my scouting experience, that absolutely was not in the Boy Scout manual or handbook. So I will swear on a stack of Dianetics books, nobody ever told me that when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
It's one page in there, and you must resist the temptation and have a cold shower immediately if you have thoughts like that, because otherwise your mind will go soft.
Wow.
And that's what will happen to you. In America, the education system, I think the 1880s, is to homogenize the population, because you've got so many disparate groups.
Yeah, well, what's it called? I mean, you talk about that whole melting pot thing. I mean, and truly a social problem. Let's not make any mistake. That was an issue. I don't know that this was the perfect solution to it.
It wasn't a solution to it. We all know that there are Italian Americans, African Americans, Greek Americans. Those societies never did, amalgamate. And you've got the Russian mafia now as well.
Yeah.
In Massachusetts, the literacy level prior to universal education has never been matched since it was forced.
That doesn't surprise me. That doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah, I'm not suggesting that the solution was a solution. I'm just suggesting that the problem exists. It is a problem, but it still hasn't been resolved. We're still a nation of over 300 million people, this country, United States, over an incredibly large, geographical area. And we're pretty much about, depending on how you estimate it, 7 to 10 different countries.
There's a book called American Nations, which estimates 11.
Yep, that's right. That's right.
And I think that's probably about right.
Yeah.
And a division now of half the population against the other half.
We do have that. We do have that. And I gotta pipe up for a second there, because I was just thinking about this morning. I can walk outside and go take a walk, which I do often, pass people on the trail. 100% smile, wave, get along great. See people in conversation. Never had an angry word or even angry face at anybody in the real world that I interact with. But online, it's like a battle zone. You're like, what? And then you have to realize that this is really just a sliver of the population. And the experience when you go out is just as real, if not more so. And I just put that out there as a little word of encouragement, because it seems like half the world is against half the world. I don't know that that's actually true.
Well, I mean, I don't think it is. I think that as with any such situation, there are a small percentage of people who belong to certain organizations that begin with K's and letters like that.
That's right.
That have become extreme in the way they behave, and that's caused. But I think that in going into the education system, my point is that we need to look at, why are we doing this?
Yes.
And we're doing this to make people pro-social. We're doing this to get people so they'll be able to live, they'll be able to pursue life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness.
Yep.
This is what it's about. It's not about gross national product. It's not about enslaving the population.
Yeah.
It's about getting the best for society and getting a society that is, rich in its humanity.
Yeah.
And I would say that there are so many things that would be simple to change in the education system. We'll be talking forever, so I'm going to just say them very quickly. The first is Matthew Walker, a professor at Berkeley in neuroscience and sleep medicine. His book, Why We Sleep, points out that we now know with no doubt that 30% of the population or thereabouts have a later clock.
Oh, right.
And we know that if you don't sleep properly, and there's no drug that can get you to do this, if you don't sleep properly, if you don't get enough deep sleep, enough REM sleep, and the other two cycles of sleep, then you will be grumpy. Your concentration will be poor, your memory will be poor. And it's been demonstrated in schools since the 1980s that if you force kids to go to school too early, they will be more aggressive.
Yep.
They will learn less.
Yep.
And you will therefore have a worse society. So point number one is let kids sleep. What's more, he points out, because that they come home from school before their parents do, that's when the trouble happens. So send them to school later. Number one. Number two, every 2 years, the Pisa Tables, I think 150 countries now are involved in Pisa Tables. These check for literacy and numeracy around the world every 2 years. And Scandinavia always comes top in literacy. Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. And there are some weird things in their system. They don't start teaching reading and writing until you're 7. And I would say that part of the brain, Wernicke's and Broca's area, if we get into it, the motor cortex, aren't actually developed enough in most people to learn to read and write until they're 7. And what happens is that parts of the brain are commandeered, what's called neuroplasticity, which are not actually ready, and you will produce what is called functional illiteracy in many people. They can read what's on the page, but they've got no idea what it means. And this is massive. There's a huge amount of people. So
I will
pushing
certainly
people to
attest
do
to that as somebody who did educate people, even if it was in a Scientology context, for literally decades of classroom experience. I can speak to a wide range. And this is in a Scientology self-selected group where the people are already actually, by necessity, generally on the intelligent side. You don't have a bunch of dunces in Scientology. I'm just telling you, you don't. They filter, they self-select out of there pretty quick because the words are big and they're hard to read. And
they haven't got enough money to pay for the courses.
Yeah, and the money, exactly. So you kind of have a better, not everyone say, oh, better class. You're going to have a higher level of average intelligence, I'm going to say. I'm just going to go out and I'm just going to say that. But even then, you better believe I was teaching people grammar and the basics of literacy every other week. Grammar and small common words were the biggest thing. And despite Hubbard's extreme views on every word has to be understood to every definition, I'm just telling you, there are people who did not know how to correctly use the word and, much less as.
But the conjunction and the preposition were the most difficult areas to get over.
Yeah.
That this is a joining word.
Yes.
Negative in the case of but or yet, and neutral in the case of and. That's this right. Is a preposition. That I too sat there again. I can remember this one particular woman who seemed perfectly intelligent, but every time we sat down, she couldn't define the word of, and it would be. Eventually she got round it. She declared herself super literate. So then they found that she'd faked all of the statistics that had got this. And then on we went. But functional literacy, forcing kids to do stuff before they're ready, making education boring rather than being a game, rather than being an adventure. The Scandinavians have a few other things they've got going. One of them is they only do one exam in the whole of their time in school.
In the entire time?
One. Yeah, just one at the end.
Wow, I hope they
pass a certificate at the end of their schooling. They're the most literate people in the world.
Oh, good point. No, good point. I can't argue with those statistics. If that's the way it is, then
they also have a higher per capita
I'm curious,
income.
How do they deal with if I might ask, and if you know, because I think to myself right away, I was picking up reading really quick with comprehension. I was just that kid.
Yeah.
What do they do with the quick learners? Because it would have been torture for me to wait until I was 7 years old.
I don't think they're going to stop you from learning. The point is that they don't inflict it upon you until.
Okay.
Okay. And we had some Swedish teachers who came over here and they were really horrified by our schools. because we have high wire fencing around them all, because we had a school shooting.
Mm-hmm.
Don't blame.
I get it. No, I get it.
Unlike America, we don't have one every other day, which is, so we have all these high wire things and it makes you think you're in a prison.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing was that we've got all these things hanging from the ceiling and all of these bright things on the wall. And the Swedish teacher going, oh, this is really... Scandinavian schools, half of the syllabus is taught outdoors.
Oh,
These
really?
are cold places, but they spend half of the day outside. So you've got a whole different
Oh, it's a whole different approach. Oh,
yeah,
wow.
of what learning is.
Okay. Okay.
If you then say, well, why do we teach the subjects we teach? And, you know, I would say that I agree with you that, you know, you should have basic skills. I'm not going to name any names here. A few months ago, I was asked to connect a television set to an aerial. And I drilled a hole in the wall and I put the coaxial cable in and I made the connection. I was astonished that the man who was asking me, who had been a university lecturer, did not understand how to do this.
That's what I'm talking about with that sorting hat, man. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Is you got people who think this way and you got people who think this way. It's there. You can test for this. I know you can. You know, I know you. But
I think that the basics, there are basic skills. I as a kid, you know, my dad was actually a mechanical engineer, but he didn't seem to have any practical skills apart from he was brilliant in the garden. He could grow anything, but you know, if he put paint on, it would dribble. You know.
Well, I happen to think, since this is coming up as a topic, that all of the basic life skills should be part of our formal education.
Exactly.
If you come out of school, you can't balance a checkbook, fuck you, right? If you come out of school, you don't know how to paint a wall, what? I mean, these are things you should definitely learn how to do.
Taking a wheel off a car.
Yes. You know, here's how your car works, you know. But again, you're going to have people who get really into that, going to be super specialized in that kind of thing. Yeah. And then you have people who are just going to want to understand the basics, and that's where they're at. And you go, good, yeah. Here's the basics of it, so that when the car is making weird noises or black smoke comes out, you don't change the tire. You know, like you have some idea that maybe that's being caused by a lack of oil or something like that. You get rudimentary understanding of things that
You've got a phone and you can call somebody.
Yeah, and these are the kind of things that you're teaching kids where it is impossible for them to raise their hand and go, when am I ever going to use this? Because it's obvious by the very nature of the lesson that it's a life lesson. You know, like those kind of, I think all those kind of skills should absolutely be part of the picture.
And then let's look at the elephant in the room. What about teaching kids about relationship? How to have a conversation with somebody, how to resolve an argument with somebody in the way that we've just done at the beginning of this, where you know, we're not shouting at each other or throwing anything. We have care and concern for each other, and therefore it becomes a responsibility for us to share our knowledge. And I've just there given the 4 points, which are Eric Fromm's definition of love. Care, concern, responsibility, and knowledge. Why don't we teach our kids about that? And, you know, it's vital knowing what a watershed is, obviously. Being able to do a quadratic equation, knowing that Magna Carta was signed in 1215 at Runnymede. You know, these are really important life lessons. But the idea that when you and your spouse are not talking to each other anymore because nobody taught you anything about communication. I mean, it's the attractive bullshit in Scientology that you're going to be taught about communication. You're actually going to be taught to stare at somebody, to stare until they submit to you.
That's right.
And looking at the way that Ron Hubbard and Mary Sue Hubbard shouted at each other and all of that, it really didn't work very well. But to teach tolerance, one of the things that really deeply concerns me is the division in society over Islam that is taking place. I've read tens of Sufi and Islam books over the years. I'm fascinated by this culture which developed so much more rapidly than the Christian culture. And I think I think history is the core subject. I really do. Understanding the past, the memory of humanity. So we should be teaching our children about the translation movement in Islam, which in the 9th century sought to collect all the wisdom of the world. It gave us algebra. It was the first place that alcohol was refined, though they don't drink it. It was to make perfume. Quarantine comes from there. The idea of optical surgery. They were performing complex optical surgery. And these things, washing, saponification, the making of soap, first happened in the Arab countries. That to understand how culture was affected, that the Crusaders learned how to wash. They didn't smell as bad. They learned manners. They learned to be vaguely polite to each other. And to say then, let's move forward to the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, Lawrence of Arabia, all that good stuff, where the Arabian countries are absolutely destroyed. They are not given any freedom. Then, in the Lebanon, only Christians were allowed to vote under the French mandate. Egypt was ruled by the British. Cruel, harsh, and awful things were done. And then you go, well, these people are annoyed with us. It's not because of the Prophet Muhammad that they're annoyed with us.
Right.
It's because of real things that happened.
Right.
And understanding the value that their culture brought and saying it's a part of evolution. We will hopefully, all of us, evolve away from some of these kind of Bronze Age ideas that seem to be so popular.
Yes.
Without getting into any detail. We'll hopefully evolve to a point where we respect other people's right to have an opinion and we tolerate them as long as they're not intolerant, as long as their beliefs are not leading them to do devastating and harmful things to others.
And that's the real pivot point. That's the real bone of contention, is hitting up against that. And that's why we need diplomacy, and we need strong diplomats, not appointed lackeys and the person who donated to your campaign most, Mr. President, gets to be the ambassador to Arabia or some bullshit. I mean,
Tony Blair gets to be the peace ambassador to the Middle East.
Yeah,
oh, come on.
Exactly.
He started the Gulf War.
Exactly, right? Might as well appoint Dick Cheney as peace ambassador to Iraq. So completely, right? Like we exaggerate for effect, but there is a problem here, and there are layers and layers of problems to this, but I think we're talking on the right points of education and the fact that education needs to meet higher standards than it's meeting right now. But I wanted to speak to the very thing, the thing you brought at the very beginning, which is really important to this, which is what is the purpose of the activity? And if the purpose of the activity is compliance and conformity, and that seems to be the well-acknowledged basic theme or purpose of the activity, then you can expect that you're not going to get the result of well-educated individuals who are prepared for life and an independent existence, because individuals and independent don't go along with the idea of conformity and compliance.
No.
They're the exact polar opposites of these things. And this is a huge problem. And I'm pointing out this pillar of problem. I mean, this is a pillar of our foundation of our society, right? Is education. So this is not a small thing, and it has everything to do with why people fall into cults and how culty crap stuff. This is not some political rant. It has everything to do with our subject. And
yes,
the same way,
is what prepares people to become part of such groups.
Exactly.
And if kids were being taught to assert themselves, if they were being taught their opinion mattered, if every morning they woke up and bounced out of bed longing to go to school, and I had a child, who actually was like that, my youngest child till he was 9 years old, he loved school, and then he got that teacher. Yeah,
there you go.
And after that, there was no cure for it. But school should be great. School should be a place, it's an adventure. I mean, the work of Sir Ken Robinson, the elements in creative schooling, this shows that there are hundreds of schools. There's one school where they kind of surveyed the kids to find out what they wanted to do, and they said, well, we'd like to race a car in the Indy 500. And you go, oh yeah, really? They did. They built their own car, and their attendance went so that the kids were getting in early in the morning, staying in the evening, going in over the weekend, and they're doing all of their subjects because they'd understood how their subjects related to this, what's called mind mapping, Tony Buzan's idea, that it makes sense. If, I want to go and be a car mechanic, why do I need to study equations? Well, you might find that actually this is useful. And that point that education has become so remote. It's like, Jonathan Swift, the rock that floats in the sky, and all of the intellectuals have conversations, and there are men with bladders who have to hit them on the head to wake them up as they drift off.
Oh, yes. Yes, I remember that. That's right. That's right.
I think most of the things you need to understand are in that book, actually, and the Ted Danson movie of Gulliver's Travels is very accurate. So everybody should go, and it's absolutely hilarious as well. But it shows how foolish we become. And I think we've forgotten, I think our society has forgotten what it's meant to be doing. That it's all this grim struggle to pay back all the money that the bankers spent on themselves. The hedge fund managers, these, speaking of predatory human beings.
Yeah, exactly.
Robert Hare said, if you want to see sociopaths, go to Wall Street.
I'll tell you, and it does raise the good question and the honest question of, how many of us are electing psychopaths, but then again, how many people who aren't psychopaths are trying to get elected? It's like it's one and the other. I mean, both of these things are a problem to this. It's like we need also, to change maybe some of the aspects of our leadership model. But, this is basically, how we should rewrite the world, 2.0. I wanted to make one final point before we wrap up here, because I know we're going to have to move toward wrapping up in a minute. And I wanted to say this as part of this conversation about predators and the use of and talking about things in a paradigm of predators, human predators, right? We brought up narcissism as a point with benign and non-benign, or
malignant.
Malignant, that's the word. I was thinking malfeasance. Yeah, malignant, right? The problem that I've seen, and I've railed against this for a while now, and I am getting 100% on the train you are, already conducting out the door, which is I am not using or trying to avoid, unless I'm being very precise, the use of diagnostic labels out of psychiatry or psychology to describe social phenomena or people that we see. We are pathologizing a bit too much with this, and when these words hit the common, discourse, the common conversation, and hit on social media and Twitter, immediately what happens? Just as these terms get watered down, they're not understood. They are complicated, multi-layered, contentious words. The word narcissism is a concept that is understood in different ways, in different places, on different subjects. And when you go using it in social media as an insult, you're actually saying things you don't totally understand, or you have to dumb it down to your simplistic idea of what it is, and that's not really what it is. And so I'm only harping on this because I think we're doing everybody a favor by getting rid of that kind of dialogue or that kind of vocabulary, and leave that vocabulary to the diagnostic people and to the professionals who actually do get all the nuance of it. We don't have to go there to insult people. Instead, we can use more common and easily understood language like human predator. Everybody immediately gets exactly what you're talking about when you say that.
Yeah, and by saying it's not, whether we lock this person in an institution or try and give them therapy or whatever. Under New Labour, Tony Blair was actually for gene testing because of this idea that there are particular genetic biases which will turn to psychopathy. And so you could label a kid from the age of 3 and ruin their lives.
Yeah, that's the worst possible idea.
Really not a great idea.
No.
The thing is to provide an environment in which even people who are born with such genes or brain dispositions, the deficiency in the paralimbic system, where the impulsive part of the brain and thinking part of the brain are not, the channel between them is not quite as thick as it ought to be. There's not enough connection. That you create a society that, and this has been shown, that through compassion and understanding, those traits are less likely to develop. James Fallon this psychopath inside. He is a brain scientist who runs 2 gene companies, who, seeing a randomized scan of his own brain, said, oh, this is somebody who's got the psychopathic thing, and who is it? And his assistant went, it's you. And he realized all his life he'd thought that everything's genetic. He's in his 50s, and he suddenly finds this thing out. And he says, my mother noticed. My mother, when I was 2 years old, she realized that I had this negativity, this desire to play pranks on people and hurt people. And she nurtured me in such a way that even though I am difficult company at times, if he says, if some other professor goes out with him, they will end up dancing naked on the table because he thinks that's funny. He took his brother on a safari to the Marburg caves in Kenya. And it was only when his brother got home and looked at Marburg that he realized this is where Ebola had come from. They're just nasty in certain ways, but he doesn't kill people. And it shows that the same way of treating our prisons are ways of making people
exactly
predators.
Exactly.
Of training them in criminality.
That's right.
And when you treat people in that way, that's the consequence you'll get. So it all fits together. By recognizing somebody as a predator, I'm not suggesting any kind of witch hunt to destroy these people, because they'll be running it within a week.
Exactly.
They'll be in charge of it.
Yes.
And we'll be the ones being hunted.
That's right.
I'm saying if we can recognize them and not put them in positions of authority above us. So I do believe, and I know that at Harvard Medical School, there's a psychiatrist there, I was very pleased to find, who's also suggested all politicians, anybody applying for political office, should do the Hare Psychopathy Checklist revised. Because although it is an imperfect instrument, and although highly intelligent people will be able to fool it, the reality is that human predators are, on average, no more intelligent than anybody else. And at least some of the more stupid ones, and I'm not naming any names here about people who like everything to be gold, like King Midas, for example, or like their name on everything. But people that are that stupid won't pass this test. And even if we could just drop down the number of predators in power and really advance, one of the things that astonished me, I was reading years and years ago, I was reading about the Plains peoples, the Lakota particularly, and found that they had, and the Cheyenne as well, the mark in their society of a great person is generosity. And when you go up to the northern tribes like Tlingit, up around Aleutian Islands and Vancouver, then it gets to be pathological. They start giving everything away. But if you are the person who killed the most buffalo in a hunt, you're expected to give them all away. And this is, so of course, Europeans would go into reservations and get all the horses and all they'd be given these things because they'd understood this thing. That bias in our culture towards narcissism, or let's just call it what it is, selfishness.
Yeah.
That bias towards greed, avarice, cupidity, there's a good word. This is not good for us.
Exactly.
We should be looking at, what is good behavior and how do you do it? And how do you get people to behave in a humane way towards each other? And we're not. Instead, and in politics, I hate this. So many people tell me, politicians, how can you tell if they're lying? Their lips are moving. Politicians are all corrupt. They have a power gene. There's something wrong with them. They're all narcissists. That's not my experience of life. My experience of life is that most of the people who go into politics genuinely want to help people. And most of the people who go into politics are corrupted by the political system.
Yes, I do believe that there is a systemic corruption process that occurs in politics that is almost, you have to, the exceptions are so few as to be non-existent. I mean, you have to be a saint, an anointed saint, to get to the level of DC politics or, or I guess, I don't know what the equivalent, I guess, parliamentary level in the UK.
Yeah, that's right.
There's no way you're going to get to that level without having shaken some hands, made some deals, and done some things that you really never wanted to do getting into that field in the first place.
But I do think that in Western Europe, we have far less corrupt political systems.
Yeah, and even as bad as it is, it's still worse in the other places. That's right. That's right.
And it shows that progress can be made. I think the Germans, for example, have a pretty good system. Occasionally, like in Italy, you've got Berlusconi, and how on earth a scumbag like Berlusconi ever got into power and then maintained it, it's hard to know. And we are seeing problems with the populist movements all over the place. But the Germans, you know, they have the most modern system because they had to make a new system in the late 1940s. They had to start again. And I think, you know, when you're stuck with something that's telling you you've got to arm bears or whatever it is the US Constitution says, Proudhon, who was one of the original anarchists, he was in the French Assembly in the 1840s, and he voted against a constitution. And his friends said to him, "How could you do that?" And he said, "Every generation needs to make its own constitution. We should not be setting rules for everybody in the future." And you then get to the movie K-Pax, where the alien character says, "You don't need laws. Everybody knows what's right and wrong." You know? Well,
yeah, as if.
but there is such a truth in it that you see books of law that, the law in this country and in the US fills up what?
Oh, absolutely. It's ridiculous.
5,000 volumes, and you're going, it's wrong to kill people.
Yeah.
It's wrong to burn places down. It's wrong to steal things, and it's just become elaborately crazy. And I think a huge part of a problem is within our corrupt justice systems. And a part of the corruption is the immense amount of money. If somebody's going to clean my house here, they're going to charge me £12 an hour. If they're going to give me legal advice, they're going to charge me £200 an hour. Now, my cleaner is more intelligent than my lawyer. There's a great book by David Graeber called Bullshit Jobs, which explains that most of the work in this world is just not contributing. And there was an analysis done of the value of work, which said that actually the least valuable people in society are accountants.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
In terms of value for money.
For money, yeah. Not as human beings, obviously.
No, let's shoot them all.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, got. Okay, let's wrap up. Yeah. Let's go ahead and wrap up. I think we've had a great discussion here. Yeah, we won't be lining any accountants up on the wall or anything. Don't worry out there.
No.
It's all good.
It's a Monty Python sketch where Michael Palin goes along and he wants to be a lion tamer, and he's actually an accountant, and then he finds out that lions aren't the creatures that burrow little holes in their skirting. And they continued to make jokes about accountants, which is, but we mean no harm. No accountants were harmed.
No accountants were harmed in the making of this podcast. Excellent. All right, guys. Well, Jon, thank you very much for joining me for some conversation here. And I hope everybody out there found our discussion at least entertaining, if not informative and educational in some fashion or another. But I think we clicked all the boxes on that one. So.
Yeah, and if you go to, we have a website, it's Opening Our Minds, and you can get a free poster, which in just one page gives you the characteristics of a human predator, and you can laminate it and stick it on your refrigerator.
Yep.
And I'm happy to say that it was a US school teacher who asked us to make this poster. So, spread it out and about. It won't cost you anything. And if you do want to spend some money, buy a copy of my book, Opening Our Minds, and you'll see more of this discussion and why we have come to these conclusions in our years and years of study of these problems.
Exactly.
Thanks so much, Chris. Always a real pleasure.
Excellent. Yeah, it's all related, folks. And of course, if you will, think about it, support the channel. It's always appreciated. And we will see you guys next week. All right. So bye.
Thanks so much.